Greetings, my fellow adventurers. It's Elara. Welcome back to our cozy sanctuary, where the gentle whispers of Middle-earth and the wonders of the Shire come alive in tales of bravery and unexpected journeys. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of a most extraordinary hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, as he ventures beyond the comforts of home into the unknown, where courage is tested and mysteries unfold. So, find your coziest spot. Let the magic of the Shire spark your imagination, and prepare to be carried away on a tale of friendship, discovery, and a hint of danger. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and which tales of Middle-earth you'd love to hear next. Let's begin. The streets of Bree were alive with the kind of bustling energy that made Bilbo Baggins feel utterly out of place. It was market day, and the town square was a whirlwind of activity. Merchants shouted to advertise their wares, horses clattered over the cobblestones, and the smells of roasted meats mingled with those of wet hay and pipe smoke. The Shire, by contrast, was so much simpler. There, days flowed like the Brandywine River, slow, steady, and unchanging. Bilbo longed for the quiet hills and familiar lanes, but instead, he found himself weaving through a crowd of strangers, clutching a tightly packed satchel in one hand and muttering under his breath. "Gandalf, why must you always pick the most inconvenient places?" he grumbled. Bilbo's journey to Bree had already been fraught with more complications than he'd care to recount. A misplaced bag of provisions at Waymeet, a sudden downpour that soaked him to the bone outside Arche, and a sleepless night in a cramped roadside inn had left him irritable. Now, as he dodged a cart piled high with barrels and narrowly avoided a trio of boisterous dwarves, he was beginning to wonder why he'd agreed to this at all. The prancing pony loomed ahead, its weathered signs swaying gently in the breeze. The warm glow of lanterns spilled out through its windows, and the muffled hum of voices promised a refuge from the chaos outside. Bilbo sighed with relief and pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the inn's smoky, bustling interior. The common room was crowded, filled with travelers of every sort. Hobbits clustered in one corner, laughing over mugs of ale, while a group of men played cards near the bar. A pair of dwarves sat by the hearth, their beards wagging as they argued in low, gruff voices. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, spilled ale, and pipe smoke, a heady mixture that made Bilbo wrinkle his nose. He scanned the room, his eyes settling almost immediately on Gandalf. The wizard was impossible to miss, even in a place as diverse as the prancing pony. He sat near the hearth, his tall frame draped in gray robes, his pointed hat tilted at an angle that suggested both weariness and amusement. Wisps of blue smoke curled from the pipe in his mouth, and his sharp eyes twinkled as he watched Bilbo approach. "Ah, there you are, my dear Bilbo," Gandalf called, his voice cutting through the noise of the room, like a bell. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost." "I very nearly did," Bilbo muttered, sliding into the chair opposite the wizard. "You might have chosen a quieter place for this meeting. Bree is hardly what I'd call comfortable." Gandalf chuckled, tapping his pipe against the side of the table to empty its ash. "Comfort, my dear hobbit, is not always the priority. Though I suspect you've had your fill of discomfort already. How was the road from the Shire? Dreadful, Bilbo replied with a scowl. Rain, mud, and a terribly rude innkeeper in Combe. But never mind that. What's this all about, Gandalf? I didn't come all this way just for a friendly chat. Indeed you did not, Gandalf said, leaning forward. His expression grew serious, though the twinkle in his eyes remained. I called you here because there is a matter of great importance that requires your particular talents. Bilbo raised an eyebrow. My talents? And what talents might those be? Oh, don't be modest, Gandalf said with a wave of his hand. You're clever, resourceful, and, most importantly, unassuming. The perfect qualities for this sort of endeavor. And what sort of endeavor is this? Bilbo asked, crossing his arms. Gandalf reached into his robes and produced a folded parchment, which he slid across the table. Bilbo hesitated for a moment before picking it up and unfolding it. It was a map, old and yellowed with age. The ink had faded in places, but the details were still legible. It depicted the region surrounding Bree, with a red mark indicating a location deep within the Chetwood. This, Gandalf began, tapping the map with one long finger, is the key to a relic of great significance. The Flame of Eldarion. The Flame of what? Bilbo asked, frowning. The Flame of Eldarion, Gandalf repeated. An artifact crafted by the Dunedain long ago. It is said to hold the power to rekindle hope and courage in times of great need. More importantly, it is a symbol, one that must not fall into the wrong hands. Bilbo's frown deepened. And what do you want with it? It is not what I want, but what Middle-earth may need, Gandalf said, his tone growing somber. The flame has been hidden for centuries, protected by wards and ancient defenses. But those defenses are weakening. There are others who seek it, Bilbo. Others who would use it for far darker purposes. Bilbo felt a chill run down his spine. And you want me to help you find it? Precisely, Gandalf said with a nod. Your small size and nimble nature make you an ideal companion for this task. Besides, I trust you, Bilbo. There are few others I would ask for such a mission. Bilbo sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always considered himself an ordinary hobbit, content with his quiet life in the Shire. The idea of venturing into the unknown, facing dangers he could scarcely imagine, was daunting to say the least. I'm not sure I'm the right hobbit for this, he said at last. Surely there are others more suited to... Nonsense, Gandalf interrupted, his voice firm. You are precisely the right hobbit. Trust me on this, Bilbo. You'll see it in time. Before Bilbo could protest further, Gandalf produced a small pouch and placed it on the table. The sound of clinking coins came from within. For your troubles, Gandalf said with a wink. Bilbo sighed. I suppose I don't have much of a choice, do I? Not if you want to hear the end of it, Gandalf said with a grin. The rest of the evening was spent poring over the map and discussing their plan. Gandalf explained that the ruins lay deep within the Chetwood, a dense and foreboding forest east of Bree. The journey would take several days, and the path would not be easy. Bilbo listened with a growing sense of dread, though he tried to hide it. The idea of trekking through a dark forest in search of an ancient relic sounded like the stuff of tales, not something an ordinary hobbit like him should be doing. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the common room began to empty, Bilbo found himself staring at the map, his fingers tracing the red mark that indicated their destination. "Why me?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to Gandalf. The wizard smiled, his expression softening. "Because, my dear Bilbo, you have the heart of an adventurer. You may not believe it yet, but you will." By the time Bilbo retired to his room, his mind was awash with thoughts of the journey ahead. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering what sort of trouble he had gotten himself into. When dawn broke the next morning, he was already dressed and packed, his satchel slung over one shoulder. Gandalf greeted him with a broad smile as they met outside the inn, the rising sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones. "Ready, my dear hobbit?" the wizard asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," Bilbo replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Gandalf chuckled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Then let us begin. The flame of Eldarion awaits." And with that, they set off, the map tucked safely in Gandalf's robes, and the promise of adventure looming ahead. The Chetwood loomed ahead like a dark secret, its towering trees forming a jagged silhouette against the pale morning sky. Bilbo and Gandalf had left Bree behind only hours ago, but already the road had grown quieter, the bustling energy of the town giving way to the hushed whispers of the wild. Bilbo tightened his grip on his walking stick, his eyes darting toward the dense forest that stretched out before them. The path they followed was little more than a narrow trail, winding through patches of bramble and thick grass. Overhead, the sky was obscured by the interlocking branches of ancient oaks and beeches, their gnarled limbs casting shifting patterns of shadow and light on the ground. "So, Gandalf," Bilbo began, breaking the silence. "These ruins, are they safe?" Gandalf, striding a few paces ahead, glanced over his shoulder. "Safe is a relative term, my dear Bilbo. But rest assured, we shall manage." "That's hardly reassuring," Bilbo muttered. He glanced down at the map Gandalf had given him, its edges already worn from handling. The red mark indicating their destination was still some distance away, but the path ahead grew increasingly uncertain. The forest closed in around them as they ventured deeper, the air growing cool and damp. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, their calls echoing through the trees. But other than that, the woods were eerily quiet. Bilbo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every time he looked over his shoulder, he saw nothing but the dense undergrowth. "Keep your eyes sharp," Gandalf said, his voice low. "The Chetwood has its share of peculiarities." "Peculiarities?" Bilbo echoed nervously. "What kind of peculiarities?" "Oh, nothing to worry about," Gandalf replied with a faint smile. "Just the odd shadow that doesn't belong, the occasional whisper on the wind. Harmless, really." Bilbo wasn't convinced. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and tried to focus on the path ahead. By midday, they came across a small clearing where an ancient stone well stood, half covered in moss. Gandalf paused, studying the well with a curious expression. "Dunedain handiwork," he said, running a hand over the weathered stone. "This well likely served the outpost we're seeking." Bilbo peered into the dark shaft of the well, shivering as a faint gust of cold air rose from its depths. "Do you think the ruins are nearby?" "Perhaps," Gandalf said thoughtfully. "But we mustn't linger. The woods have a way of misleading travelers." As they continued, the path grew more treacherous. Tree roots jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, and the underbrush became thicker, snagging at Bilbo's cloak and trousers. He stumbled several times, muttering under his breath about wizards and their fondness for inconvenient quests. The afternoon wore on, and the forest seemed to grow darker, even though the sun was still high in the sky. Shadows moved strangely among the trees, and the air grew heavy, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Gandalf," Bilbo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are we alone?" Gandalf stopped, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. "Not entirely, I suspect. The forest is ancient, and ancient places often have a way of attracting attention." "Attention?" Bilbo hissed. "From what?" "Keep walking," Gandalf said firmly, "and do not stray from the path." They pressed on, and soon the trees thinned, revealing the crumbled remains of a stone archway. Beyond it lay the ruins of the Dunedain outpost, its walls covered in moss and ivy. The structures were barely more than jagged outlines, their edges softened by time, but the air around them felt charged, as though the place still held echoes of its past. Gandalf stopped just outside the archway, his expression unreadable. "Here we are?" Bilbo hesitated, peering through the arch. The ruins were eerily silent, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "It doesn't look very welcoming." "It wasn't meant to be," Gandalf said, stepping forward. "Come along, we mustn't dawdle." The ground within the ruins was uneven, littered with broken stones and patches of overgrown grass. Gandalf led the way, his staff glowing faintly in the dim light. Bilbo followed reluctantly, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. "Where exactly is this flame of Eldarion?" Bilbo asked, his voice trembling slightly. "In the central hall, if the map is to be trusted," Gandalf replied. "But be wary. The flame is guarded." "Guarded?" Bilbo froze. "By what?" "Not what," Gandalf said, his tone grave. "But whom? The Dunedain left wardens here, spirits bound to protect the flame from those who would misuse it." Bilbo's mouth went dry. "Spirits? You mean ghosts?" "Of a sort," Gandalf said, glancing at him. "But do not fear. We come with no ill intent. They may choose to let us pass." "And if they don't?" Bilbo asked, his voice rising. "Then we must be very persuasive," Gandalf said, with a wry smile. The central hall was the most intact part of the ruins, its high ceiling supported by crumbling pillars. At its center stood a pedestal, and atop it burned a small, steady flame, its light flickering softly in the gloom. The flame of Eldarion. Bilbo stared at it, both awed and apprehensive. The fire seemed almost alive, its golden glow pulsing faintly as they approached. "Is that it?" Bilbo asked. "It is," Gandalf said, his voice reverent. "The flame of Eldarion, a relic of the Dunedain, and a beacon of hope. Before they could step closer, a low, resonant voice echoed through the hall. "Who dares disturb this sacred place?" Bilbo jumped, his heart racing. From the shadows emerged 3 figures, their forms faintly translucent, and their faces shrouded in mist. They were clad in the tattered remnants of Dunedain armor, their eyes glowing faintly like embers. "We mean no harm," Gandalf said, stepping forward. "We seek the flame, not for greed or power, but to protect it from those who would misuse it." The spirits regarded him silently, their ethereal forms flickering. One of them, a tall figure with a scarred face, spoke again. "The flame is not for the living to wield lightly. Prove your worth, or leave this place." "Prove our worth?" Bilbo whispered, looking at Gandalf. "What does that mean?" "It means we'll have to convince them," Gandalf said, his tone calm but firm. "Stay close to me." The spirits moved swiftly, their forms blurring as they surrounded the pedestal. One of them raised a spectral blade, its edge shimmering with cold light. Gandalf raised his staff, its glow brightening as he spoke words of power in a language Bilbo didn't understand. The air crackled with energy, and the hall seemed to tilt slightly, as though the ruins themselves were coming alive. Bilbo clutched his walking stick, his knuckles white, and tried not to panic. "Bilbo!" Gandalf called. "The flame. Reach for it." "What?" Bilbo shouted. "Are you mad?" "Trust me," Gandalf said. "You're the only one who can." Heart pounding, Bilbo darted toward the pedestal, dodging as one of the spirits swung its blade. The flame pulsed brighter as he approached, its warmth washing over him. As his fingers closed around it, the hall was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, the spirits were gone, and the ruins were silent once more. Bilbo stood trembling, the flame of Eldarion cradled in his hands. Its golden glow seemed softer now, almost soothing. "Well done, Bilbo," Gandalf said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I knew you had it in you." Bilbo stared at the wizard, his heart still racing. "You might have warned me." "Where's the fun in that?" Gandalf said with a grin. As they left the ruins, the Chetwood seemed less foreboding, its shadows lighter and its air less heavy. Bilbo couldn't help but feel a small swell of pride, though he was still too shaken to admit it. "Never again," he muttered. "No more adventures." Gandalf chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Oh, Bilbo, you say that now." The morning air was crisp, as Bilbo and Gandalf left the ruins behind, their steps crunching softly on the forest floor. The Chetwood seemed less foreboding in the daylight, its shadows receding as golden light filtered through the trees. Still, an air of unease lingered, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Bilbo glanced at Gandalf, who walked briskly ahead, his staff tapping rhythmically against the ground. The flame of Eldarion, now dimmed to a faint ember-like glow, was safely wrapped in cloth and tucked into Gandalf's satchel. Bilbo's own pack felt heavy on his shoulders, but he didn't dare complain. The events of the ruins were still fresh in his mind, and the memory of the spectral guardians sent a shiver down his spine. "How much longer to Bree?" Bilbo asked, breaking the silence. "If we maintain a steady pace, we should reach the town by nightfall," Gandalf replied. He glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the trees. "Though, I suggest, we keep our wits about us. The road may not be as empty as it seems." "That's hardly comforting," Bilbo muttered, tightening his grip on his walking stick. The journey began uneventfully, the path winding through patches of open glades and dense thickets. Bilbo found himself lost in thought, his mind drifting between the comfort of home and the strange, unsettling events of the past few days. He was just beginning to relax when a faint sound reached his ears. A distant rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. "Did you hear that?" he asked, stopping in his tracks. Gandalf paused, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly, listening. For a moment, the forest was silent, save for the distant call of a crow. Then it came again, a faint, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. "We're not alone," Gandalf said quietly. "Keep moving, but stay close to me." Bilbo swallowed hard, his heart pounding as they quickened their pace. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and every shadow seemed to shift ominously. The path narrowed as they entered a denser part of the forest, the trees arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. Suddenly, Gandalf stopped and raised his staff. "They're here." From the shadows emerged a group of figures cloaked in darkness, their forms wreathed in a faint, unnatural mist. Their movements were deliberate and silent, their faces obscured beneath heavy hoods. One of them stepped forward, and though its features remained hidden, Bilbo felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. "The flame," the figure hissed, its voice like the scraping of metal. "Surrender it." Gandalf planted his staff firmly on the ground, and its tip began to glow with a bright, silvery light. "The flame of Eldarion is not yours to claim," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Begone, and trouble us no further." The figures did not move. Instead, the leader raised a hand, and the air around them seemed to grow heavier. Bilbo's breath caught in his throat as the shadows around the figures writhed and shifted, taking on forms that were almost solid. They began to advance. "Bilbo," Gandalf said sharply, "stay behind me." Before Bilbo could respond, the forest erupted into chaos. One of the shadowy figures lunged toward Gandalf, its movements unnaturally fast. Gandalf swung his staff, and a burst of light shot forth, striking the figure and sending it reeling. Another figure darted toward Bilbo, its clawed hand outstretched. With a yelp, Bilbo swung his walking stick wildly, striking the creature across the arm. It staggered back, hissing in pain, but more were closing in. Gandalf's staff flashed repeatedly as he fended off the attackers, his voice ringing out in a series of powerful incantations. "Bilbo!" Gandalf called. "Move toward the clearing." Bilbo didn't need to be told twice. Clutching his stick tightly, he darted through the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows seemed to press in around him, their whispers filling his ears. Just as one of the creatures leapt toward him, Gandalf appeared, his staff blazing with light. "Keep going!" Gandalf shouted, his expression fierce. "I'll hold them off." They burst into a clearing, the sudden openness a stark contrast to the claustrophobic forest. Gandalf raised his staff high, its light forming a protective circle around them. The shadowy figures hesitated at the edge of the clearing, their forms flickering like candle flames. "They fear the light," Gandalf said, his voice low but firm. "But they won't stop. We must move quickly." Bilbo nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched his walking stick. What are they?" "Remnants of a darker time," Gandalf replied. "Creatures twisted by malice and drawn to the flame's power, they seek to claim it for themselves." "And what happens if they get it?" Bilbo asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "They won't," Gandalf said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Now, stay close." The remainder of the journey was a blur of tension and haste. The shadowy figures continued to pursue them, appearing at the edges of the path like specters of doom. Gandalf's staff provided a constant shield of light, but Bilbo could feel the strain in the wizard's movements, the weariness in his steps. As the sun began to set, the forest thinned, and the outskirts of Bree came into view. The sight of the town's wooden gates filled Bilbo with a surge of relief, but the shadows were not yet gone. The figures had grown bolder, their forms coalescing into solid shapes that moved with unnerving speed. "Quickly," Gandalf urged, his voice strained. "We're almost there." They reached the gates just as the first of the creatures lunged toward them. Gandalf turned, his staff blazing with light that illuminated the entire area. The creature let out a shriek, its form dissolving into mist as the light struck it. The others faltered, their movements hesitant. The gatekeeper appeared, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What in the name of—" "Open the gates," Gandalf commanded. "Now." The gatekeeper obeyed without question, and Bilbo and Gandalf stumbled through just as the remaining creatures melted back into the shadows. Inside the safety of Bree, Bilbo collapsed onto a bench, his legs shaking. His hands were still clutching his walking stick, though he wasn't sure he could muster the strength to lift it again. "Well," he said between ragged breaths, "that was unpleasant." Gandalf sat beside him, his expression weary but calm. "You handled yourself well, Bilbo. Few hobbits could have done the same." Bilbo shot him a withering look. "I'd rather not make a habit of it." Gandalf chuckled softly, though his eyes were distant, as though still watching the shadows beyond the gate. "The flame is safe, for now. But this is only the beginning, Bilbo. Dark forces are stirring, and the road ahead will only grow more perilous." Bilbo sighed, leaning back against the bench. "Then I hope someone else is foolish enough to take it. I'm going back to the Shire. For now," Gandalf said with a knowing smile. "But you may find that adventures have a way of finding you, whether you seek them or not." As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Bilbo couldn't help but reflect on the strange, terrifying events of the day. The Shire suddenly seemed very far away, its quiet hills and peaceful lanes like a dream. But even as he longed for the comfort of home, a small part of him couldn't deny the thrill of having faced the unknown and survived. And though he didn't yet realize it, this would not be the last time Bilbo Baggins found himself in the company of wizards, relics, and shadows. A curious letter. It was a brisk spring morning in the Shire, and Bilbo Baggins was taking a leisurely walk along the grassy lanes near Overhill. The fresh scent of dew lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of blooming wildflowers. The hills rolled endlessly around him, dotted with small hobbit holes tucked into their sides. Farmers waved from their fields, and the occasional cart trundled by, its driver humming an old Hobbit tune. Bilbo had left Bag End early that morning, feeling the itch for a stroll beyond his usual paths. He liked this part of the Shire, quiet, with only the occasional sound of a babbling brook, or the distant call of a thrush to break the stillness. It was a place where the world felt wide and peaceful, and a hobbit could be alone with his thoughts. As he meandered up a gentle hill, he noticed something unusual. At the base of an old oak tree, a small, battered envelope lay half buried in the grass. It was odd enough to make Bilbo pause. Letters were rare in the Shire, and rarer still was one left in the middle of nowhere. Curious, Bilbo picked it up and examined it. The parchment was weathered, the edges frayed as though it had traveled a long way. The envelope was sealed with a blob of red wax, bearing an unfamiliar sigil. A tiny bird perched atop a crescent moon. "What on earth is this doing here?" Bilbo murmured. The front of the envelope bore his name in spidery handwriting. To Mr. Bilbo Baggins. No address, no explanation, just his name. Bilbo glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the tree and claim it as theirs. But there was no one. The lane was empty, save for a pair of sparrows hopping along the hedgerow. He hesitated for a moment, then broke the seal. The wax cracked cleanly, and he unfolded the parchment within. The letter read, "Dearest Bilbo, it has been many years since last we spoke, but I find myself in dire need of a trustworthy companion. You are the only one I can turn to for this matter, as it is delicate and requires a hobbit's particular discretion. Enclosed, you will find a small token, a map. It leads to an item of great personal importance, hidden in a place I cannot reach myself. You will find more details awaiting you at the Prancing Pony in Bree. Please meet me there within the fortnight. I assure you, there is no danger involved, only a matter of trust and old promises. Your old friend, R." Bilbo frowned, turning the letter over in his hands. "R," he muttered. "Rory Took, perhaps? No, he's never been one for letters. Could it be Rupert Proudfoot? Or, Tucked inside the envelope was a second piece of parchment, a crude map. It showed a rough outline of the Shire and its surrounding lands, with a bold red X marked near Bree. Bilbo's first instinct, his sensible Baggins side, was to toss the letter in the nearest fire and think no more of it. A trip to Bree? It was far too much trouble. He had no business wandering so far from home, especially on the word of an unnamed friend. But his Tookish side, the part of him that stirred at the thought of adventure, wouldn't let it go. The letter was too peculiar, the map too intriguing to ignore. "Well," he said aloud, pacing the lane, "there's no harm in going to Bree, is there? A nice walk, a pint of ale, and back again in a few days. Perfectly harmless." Yet, deep down, He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this letter than met the eye. The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Bilbo returned to his hobbit hole to pack a small bag with the essentials: bread, cheese, apples, and a flask of tea. He debated bringing his pocket knife, but decided against it. After all, this was just a simple trip, nothing dangerous. By late afternoon, he locked the round green door behind him and set off along the road toward Waymeet. The sky was beginning to shift, the golden light of day giving way to the soft hues of evening. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of fresh earth and budding flowers. As Bilbo walked, he couldn't help but wonder about the letter's sender. The sigil on the seal was unfamiliar, and the handwriting offered no clues. Who was Ar? What was this item of great importance? And why had they chosen him, of all hobbits, to help? He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the figure watching him from the shadows of the hedgerow. It wasn't until the faint sound of a snapping twig reached his ears that he froze, glancing over his shoulder. The lane was empty. The fields stretched wide and quiet under the darkening sky. But Bilbo's unease lingered. "Nonsense," he muttered, shaking his head. "Just my imagination." Still, he quickened his pace. The Shire was a safe place, wasn't it? There was nothing to worry about. And yet, as he pressed on toward Waymeet, the feeling of being watched stayed with him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. When Bilbo reached the small hamlet of Waymeet, night had fallen, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky. He found lodging at a modest inn, the kind that offered warm food and quiet company, just the way Bilbo liked it. As he lay in bed that night, the letter and map tucked safely in his bag, Bilbo couldn't help but feel that this journey was only the beginning of something far larger than he'd anticipated. The next morning, Bilbo awoke early, stirred not by the usual comforts of home, but by the pull of curiosity. The modest inn at Waymeet was bustling even at dawn, with farmers and merchants beginning their day. Bilbo ate a simple breakfast of porridge and honey, paid the innkeeper with a few silver coins, and slung his small pack over his shoulder. The road to Bree would take him through lands he'd rarely visited, rolling fields giving way to wilder terrain, where the paths were less traveled and the air carried a faint scent of pine and distant rain. For any other hobbit, this might have been a daunting prospect. But Bilbo, despite his natural inclination toward comfort and safety, found a flicker of excitement stirring in his chest. "Just a short walk," he reminded himself, adjusting the strap of his bag. "A little errand, really. Nothing to fret over." He hadn't told anyone about the letter or the map. Something about it felt too strange, too personal to share. As he set off from Waymeet, he resolved to keep the matter to himself until he reached Bree, and found out exactly what Ar wanted from him. The first leg of the journey was pleasant enough. The sun shone brightly, and the road was well kept, winding through meadows dotted with daisies and dandelions. Bilbo passed the occasional traveler, hobbit farmers carting goods to market, a singing dwarf with a pack full of wares, and even a ranger cloaked in gray, who nodded politely as they passed. But as the hours wore on, and the road grew lonelier, Bilbo began to notice the subtle shift in the air. The trees that lined the path grew taller and darker, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like bony fingers. The cheerful songs of birds gave way to the low rustle of leaves, and the occasional gust of wind carried with it the faint whisper of something distant and unplaceable. Bilbo tightened his grip on his walking stick, glancing over his shoulder. The lane stretched empty behind him, yet the feeling of being watched had returned. "Nonsense," he muttered under his breath. "Just nerves, nothing more." Still, he quickened his pace. By midday, Bilbo reached a small clearing where the road split in two directions. A crooked wooden sign pointed the way to Bree, though its letters were so worn and faded that they were barely legible. Bilbo paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath and take a sip from his flask of tea. As he rested, his eyes wandered to the edge of the clearing, where something unusual caught his attention. A scrap of fabric, torn and frayed, clung to a bramble bush. It was dark green and looked as though it had been part of a cloak. Curious, Bilbo stepped closer, examining the scrap. It was damp from the morning dew, but otherwise unremarkable. Still, its presence here, in the middle of nowhere, felt out of place. "Someone's been through here recently," he murmured. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. He wasn't alone on this road, but who else might be traveling these parts? And why did the thought make his skin prickle with unease? Shaking his head, Bilbo tucked the flask back into his bag and continued down the path toward Bree. The afternoon passed uneventfully, though the feeling of unease lingered like a shadow at Bilbo's back. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his ears were keenly attuned to every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig. By the time the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Bilbo knew he needed to find a place to camp. He was too far from Bree to reach the inn tonight, and traveling in the dark was out of the question. After some searching, he found a sheltered spot beneath a large oak tree, where the ground was soft with moss, and the overhanging branches offered some protection from the night air. Bilbo laid out his bedroll, lit a small fire, and settled down with a piece of bread and cheese for supper. As he ate, his thoughts returned to the letter, and the map tucked safely in his bag. Who was Ar, and why had they sent for him? What was this item of great importance that required such secrecy? His musings were interrupted by a faint sound in the distance, a soft, rhythmic thud, like the fall of hooves on dirt. Bilbo froze, straining his ears. The sound grew louder, then stopped abruptly. He glanced around, heart pounding. The fire cast flickering shadows across the clearing, but beyond its light, the darkness pressed in thick and impenetrable. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. No answer came, only the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Bilbo's grip tightened on his walking stick. He told himself it was nothing, just a stray pony, or perhaps a deer wandering through the woods. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Sleep did not come easily that night. Bilbo lay awake, staring up at the canopy of leaves, his ears attuned to every sound. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its mournful call echoing through the night. When dawn finally broke, Bilbo felt as though he hadn't slept at all. He packed up his things quickly, eager to put the night behind him and press on toward Bree. The sooner he reached the prancing pony, the better. The final stretch of the journey was the most difficult. The road grew narrow and uneven, winding through dense woods where the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy of leaves. Bilbo's feet ached, and his spirits were low, but the thought of a warm meal and a pint of ale at the inn kept him moving. As he rounded a bend in the road, Bree finally came into view. The town sat nestled in a small valley, its wooden gates flanked by tall watchtowers. Smoke curled from the chimneys of its houses, and the sound of distant voices and laughter drifted on the breeze. Bilbo quickened his pace, relief flooding through him as he approached the gates. "Halt!" called a gruff voice. Bilbo looked up to see a gatekeeper leaning on a long staff, his eyes narrowing as he studied the hobbit. "What business brings you to Bree, stranger?" Bilbo hesitated, suddenly aware of how out of place he must seem. A lone hobbit wandering into town with a pack slung over his shoulder. "I'm here to meet a friend," he said, hoping his voice sounded more confident than he felt. The gatekeeper eyed him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Go on, then. But mind your step. Bree's not as quiet as the Shire." Bilbo thanked him and hurried through the gates, his eyes scanning the bustling streets for the familiar sign of the prancing pony. The inn was larger than he remembered, its walls weathered by years of wind and rain. Warm light spilled from its windows, and the sound of laughter and clinking mugs greeted him as he stepped inside. The common room was crowded, filled with travelers of all shapes and sizes. Hobbits, dwarves, and even a few men. Bilbo made his way to the bar, where a burly man with a ruddy face greeted him. "Evening, friend," said the man. "What'll it be?" "A pint of ale, please," Bilbo replied. As the barkeep poured the drink, Bilbo glanced around the room, searching for anyone who might be his mysterious R. But no one seemed to take notice of him. "Looking for someone?" the barkeep asked, sliding the pint across the counter. Bilbo hesitated. "Yes, actually. I'm supposed to meet an old friend here." "Well, you're not the first," the barkeep said with a chuckle. "Plenty of folk pass through Bree on their way to one place or another. You'll find them, don't worry." The common room of the prancing pony had begun to quiet down as the evening wore on. Bilbo, sitting in his corner with a pint of ale, felt a growing impatience. He had been here for hours, scanning the room for a sign of this mysterious R. The letter and map, now slightly crumpled from handling, rested on the table before him. The crowd had thinned, and Bilbo began to wonder if he'd been the victim of a practical joke. Then, just as he was about to give up, a shadow passed over his table. "Bilbo Baggins, I presume?" The voice was soft, yet firm, with a hint of amusement. Bilbo looked up to see a tall figure cloaked in green and brown, their hood drawn low. "Yes," Bilbo said, trying to sound composed. "And you are?" The figure chuckled. "I am Reynard Took, though you may simply call me Reynard. We're family, after all, even if distantly. And you, my dear cousin, have answered my call most dutifully." Reynard removed his hood, revealing sharp features and unruly brown curls that immediately struck Bilbo as familiar. He gestured for Bilbo to follow him into a small private room at the back of the inn. Inside the room, a fire crackled in the hearth, and a map was spread across the table. Reynard gestured for Bilbo to sit, then leaned forward, his face alight with excitement. I assume the letter intrigued you enough to bring you here, Reynard said, tapping the map. But now it's time for the truth. I didn't call you here just for an item of personal importance. This is a quest, Bilbo. One with a history far older than either of us. Bilbo frowned. A quest? Surely you jest. Hobbits don't go on quests, and we certainly don't. Ah, but we do, Reynard interrupted, his eyes gleaming. You see, this map leads to the final resting place of a Took heirloom, lost for generations. It's a compass, crafted by the dwarves and enchanted with their old runes. Legend has it that it points not north, but to whatever the holder desires most. Bilbo's skepticism deepened. A magical compass? Sounds like a tall tale to me. It's no tale, Reynard said sharply. The compass was hidden in the ruins of an ancient outpost, deep in the Chetwood. And there's more. The journal I found spoke of guardians, creatures bound to the place, warding off anyone who seeks to take the artifact. Bilbo paled. Guardians? What kind of guardians? Reynard waved the question away. Details for later. For now, we must leave at dawn. The Chetwood is a day's journey from here, and if we delay, others might find it first. Others? Bilbo repeated, but Reynard offered no further explanation. The next morning, the two hobbits set off at first light, leaving Bree behind and venturing into the wilderness. The air grew colder as they approached the edge of the Chetwood, and the cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by an eerie silence. The forest loomed ahead, its trees towering like sentinels, their branches interlocked to form a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. Bilbo hesitated at the edge of the woods, his unease growing. Are you sure about this? He asked. Reynard nodded. Trust me, cousin. The compass lies within. Stay close, and keep your wits about you. With that, they entered the forest. The Chetwood was unlike any place Bilbo had ever been. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The path, if it could be called that, was narrow and winding, forcing the hobbits to climb over roots and duck under low-hanging branches. After hours of trudging through the woods, they came across a peculiar sight. A stone archway half buried in moss and vines. Beyond it lay a crumbling structure, its walls covered in faded carvings. This is it, Reynard whispered, his voice tinged with awe. They stepped through the archway, entering a courtyard filled with broken pillars and scattered rubble. In the center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a small, ornate box. Reynard approached the pedestal cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for signs of danger. Bilbo followed, clutching his walking stick tightly. As Reynard reached for the box, the air grew heavy, and a low growl echoed through the courtyard. Bilbo froze. From the shadows emerged a pair of wolf-like creatures, their eyes glowing an unnatural green. Their fur bristled, and their lips curled back to reveal sharp fangs. What are those? Bilbo stammered. The Guardians, Reynard said grimly. Stay back! One of the creatures lunged, its jaws snapping inches from Reynard's arm. He dodged, grabbing the box and shouting, "Run!" The hobbits sprinted through the ruins, the creatures in hot pursuit. The forest seemed to twist and shift around them, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage. Bilbo's heart pounded as he stumbled over roots and rocks, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Keep moving," Reynard shouted, his voice barely audible over the growls and snarls behind them. They burst into a clearing, but the creatures didn't relent. One lunged at Bilbo, who swung his walking stick wildly, managing to strike the beast's flank. It yelped and fell back, but its companions circled closer. "We can't outrun them," Bilbo cried. Reynard fumbled with the box, finally opening it to reveal the compass. The artifact glowed faintly, its needle spinning wildly before settling in one direction. "This way," Reynard shouted, dragging Bilbo toward a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The compass seemed to guide them, weaving through the maze-like woods with uncanny precision. The creatures gave chase, but the path twisted and turned so sharply that they began to lose ground. At last, the hobbits emerged from the forest, the sunlight blinding after the dimness of the chetwood. The creatures stopped at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes watching silently as the hobbits collapsed onto the grass. As they caught their breath, Reynard held up the compass, its glow fading. "We did it," he said, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. Bilbo groaned, his legs aching and his nerves frayed. That was madness, absolute madness. "Perhaps," Reynard admitted, "but we've recovered a piece of Took history, a treasure that might one day serve the Shire." Bilbo shook his head, though a small part of him couldn't deny the thrill of their adventure. When Bilbo finally returned to the Shire, he carried with him not just the memory of the journey, but a newfound appreciation for the quiet comforts of home. And though he never told anyone the full tale, he often found himself glancing at maps and wondering what other secrets lay hidden beyond the borders of the Shire. As the tale of Bilbo Baggins' unexpected adventure draws to a close, let this journey remind us of the courage that can rise from even the smallest of hearts, and the mysteries that lie just beyond the comfort of home. Remember, my fellow adventurers, that even in the shadow of danger and the pull of the unknown, a steadfast spirit and a touch of hobbit wit can carry us through. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the rolling hills of the Shire, the warmth of a hobbit's hearth, and the promise of new journeys waiting to unfold. Good night.